thanks very much for the invitation to a very interesting meeting so far. My talk is also about big data, but I actually hate this term because it's so fuzzy and everybody seems to talk about something else when they talk about big data. So I think the previous talk was more about big data, which is an electronic health records and generated in a clinical setting. My talk is more about the kind of big data which is on the internet, natural language data, which is interesting for public health purposes and which we analyze, and there's a huge potential in analyzing these data for public health purposes. And that's a field I personally call infodemiology or infovalence, which is also in the title. And it's all about monitoring social media and also other unconventional data sources like internet search queries. And being a talk about social media, I'm also using social media, so you can reach me through Twitter, and I also put these slides on SlideShare. To start with a few words about myself, so I'm a professor at the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto in Canada. And by the way, Toronto is going to host the Pan Am Games this year, so I'm very inspired by this meeting to kind of maybe put together a little research program to pilot test some of the technologies which may be implemented on a larger scale at the Olympics here in Brazil. So if you're interested in talking with me about it, let me know. I'm also a senior scientist at the Center for Global E-Health Innovation, and another hat I'm wearing is I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Medical Internet Research, which is now the leading journal in this field, in the field of e-health. It's ranked #1 by impact factor. It's an impact factor of 4.7 now, and we're also the leading journal in terms of size. So this year we're going to publish around 1,000 papers, and a lot of these papers are actually what I call infodemiology studies. So we organize some of the papers in e-collections, and there's an e-collection on infodemiology. And I should also mention that it's more than one journal now. We actually created a number of sister journals, and one of these sister journals, and you found some cards in your seats, is the new JMIR Public Health and Surveillance, which will include traditional surveillance papers, but also these kind of novel approaches of infodemiology, infovalence, digital disease detection, however you want to call it. So that's one perspective, the perspective of a journal editor, and as journal editors we're sometimes faced with some difficult ethical questions, and I will go into detail a bit later. But my other perspective is also the perspective of a researcher, because I have done this kind of research for, I would say, almost 15 years now. In fact, my group was one of the first, if not the first, group publishing about the correlation of search terms and influenza outbreaks. We used Canadian data and Google data, and we published this 2 years before the famous Nature paper from Google itself. And in this paper, which was published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, I outlined what I mean by infodemiology. So basically the idea here is that you have a population with conditions, diseases, behaviors, attitudes, and you try to what we try to measure with traditional epidemiological methods is to pick up the distribution of these conditions or also health behaviors, and to inform public health professionals and policymakers. They make decisions. These in turn influence population behavior, attitudes, health status, and so on. But traditional epidemiological methods are very slow. And in essence, all of this population behavior, attitudes, health status is now also reflected on the internet by what people are talking about, what they're saying, what they're tweeting these days. And if we pick this up by methods which are called infodemiological methods or infovalence, then we can maybe give a more timely signal to public health professionals and policymakers on the things that are that are on the horizon or which are going to come. So one other example for an infodemiology study, which we did in 2009, is monitoring Twitter. So this was one of the first studies where we monitored Twitter during a pandemic, during H1N1. And we learned some interesting lessons on what people were tweeting about during the pandemic, what the relationship between sentiment and tweets and actual death rates, etc. is, and how also the news media influence the tweet volume and the sentiment and so on. But I'm not here to talk about this kind of work, so this talk is about the ethical implications of this. And last year there was a study which was out there in the media, which was heavily criticized, and that was this study published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, on an experiment which was conducted at Facebook. So what they basically did was they did what's called an A/B test, which is a randomized trial basically, among 700,000 Facebook users, where they altered the news feed, and they wanted to see if they received more negative messages from their friends, for example, because the newsfeed in Facebook is basically what your friends are posting, but it's not everything. You don't see everything. Facebook has its own algorithm on what you're seeing, and what they altered here was they wanted to see if people seen more negative messages, but they also post more negative status updates and news stories. And the result was yes, you can kind of influence the posting behavior by altering the newsfeed in that way. So that study was heavily criticized. So there were headlines like Facebook manipulates 700,000 users' news feeds in secret study, prompting backlash. There was talks about the Facebook fiasco. Was it an ethics breach? And the Facebook study sparked soul-searching and ethical questions. And what became really apparent in this discussion was that there is a tension between what's regarded as legitimate and widespread industry practice, which is that users agree to terms of use, which actually nobody reads, but it's somewhere in the terms of use that basically company owns all your data, they can use it for research, they can experiment with it. So that's what's typically in the terms of use. Users, even though they don't read it, most of us understand that. I think in most cases there's a trade-off between that we agree to give away our data, our browsing data, in return for getting a free service, in most cases free. And what's also widespread industry practice, of course, is A/B testing, also called split testing, which is kind of a mini randomized trial. So if you go on the internet, you're probably subjected to 100 randomized control trials without even knowing it, because when companies make a change, be it only change in color of the background or where they place things, it's usually run as a trial, and that's how they figure out what the best design is or what the best conversion rates are. So that's the industry practice. In research, we are of course bound by or held to a little bit higher ethical standards, where usually we're expected to inform users about what kind of experiments we are conducting, and usually we should also give them the ability to opt out. Of course, this is not always the case. Actually, many epidemiological studies obviously don't require informed consent on a case-by-case basis, but usually we are expected to obtain informed consent if possible. And that also creates a dilemma for us as journal editors, because we know there's a wealth of data out there. Facebook, Google, they all sit on really valuable data, which can tell us a lot about human behavior and health promotion and health prevention. But we are not even allowed, we wouldn't be even allowed to publish it without this kind of, with some minimal ethical standards being fulfilled. And that was a dilemma also for PNAS, for example, when they published the study. They had this data which was generated by Facebook. And well, the way they got around this was that they published a study, but they also published an editorial which says basically we're concerned about lack of informed consent. So usually the way we handle this is if we get papers from industry which do not require an R&D because they don't have IRB, we still ask the author if there was any kind of external committee or committee, at least within the company, where that committee gave some feedback on the study. So, for example, this study here was published by Microsoft. So they also did some analysis of search queries and if they can predict cycling mood disorders. And there was no mentioning on ethics, but we asked them, was there any kind of internal committee which gave advice, and unfortunately they said they did have something like that, the Microsoft Ethics Committee. And it's also important that ideally that committee gives input before the research starts, and also not just rubber stamping the research, but also giving active feedback. So why do we need these external committees? I mean, as a researcher, I'm very well aware of the fact that it's a bit of a pain to write these ethics applications, but it is important that there is a third party, not the researchers themselves, but a third party which does a harm versus benefit analysis, especially if there's a media backlash, like in the Facebook study. It's also good for the researcher to cover his tracks and to say, okay, well, this was evaluated by an independent party, and it's not just my assessment that there's no harm in doing this. Of course, in the Facebook study, there was no real harm, but there were a number of keywords in that study which really created this public outcry. So there was talk about altering emotional states, and it was a secret experiment, so it was not disclosed. And on top of this, it was even funded by the military, so there was in the acknowledgement, there was some indication that the military had given some grant, and that really also made people very concerned. So after last year, we conducted a little rapid representative survey among the U.S. internet population, and we asked them, would you expect Facebook to inform users and enable opt-out? And 68% agreed to that. And there's also a clear age difference here. So if you ask younger users, they're much more, I think, aware of the fact that if they go on the internet, there's no privacy, and they say, yeah, whatever, they can have my data. Whereas older people say, yeah, I need to know what's going on here, and I want to have the ability to opt out. And so even for A/B testing, which are basically just design tests, not even like altering the mood or altering posting behavior, but just A/B testing to figure out the best design. Even for this scenario, 24% wanted to have the ability to opt out. 40% said that they're not aware of the fact that these kind of experiments are going on, whereas only 10% said, no, I don't mind, I don't care. And then also going back to infodemiology research, or what we're doing, which is basically trying to gather intelligence from posting behavior or status updates like tweets. So I said here in this question, I said, well, this is going on a routine basis. Companies are doing this to gather intelligence. The government is doing it. Public health officials are doing it. Do you mind that this is being done? And even here, 27% said they want to opt out of this. 9% said they didn't know this is going on. And it's also interesting that we cannot argue that if it's for a good purpose, like it's for public health, then people are okay with it. It's only 5%, and by the way, multiple answers were possible. Only 5% said, yeah, I agree if it's for public health purposes. 5% agree if it's for government. 4% agree if it's for companies. So, in a way, as Michael Ross wrote, who's a committee member of the American Psychological Association Committee on Human Research, said, perhaps it's like undressing in front of an open window and then being outraged that someone watched, but that sense of outrage is real. Perhaps it's also time to revisit our ethical frameworks, which largely date to the pre-digital age in the light of recent developments in data collection and storage on the internet. Now, all this discussion is not entirely new. So actually, it's already 14 years ago that I published a paper in the BMJ on the ethics of doing qualitative research in internet communities. And this paper was, in the beginning, it was hardly cited by anybody, but now in the recent years, it's cited a lot, because I think it contains some useful parameters or formulas which researchers should look at when they frame their research and if they apply for ethics approval. So things like that, they should keep in mind how intrusive their research is, what the perceived privacy in the community is, in the internet community, which is largely a function of group size, so it makes it different if there's, for example, a mailing list with only 10 participants, or there's a mailing list with 1,000 participants, or if there's Twitter. There are differences in terms of perceived privacy. Even Twitter, even though Twitter is public, but some people still perceive it as something semi-private. And in fact, there have been cases where people tweeted something stupid and they got fired. And then there was a lawsuit and they argued, well, I didn't really tweet it out to the public, I just tweeted it to my friends and family, right? So this is what I mean with perceived privacy, which has nothing necessarily to do with how private or accessible the information is in reality. Vulnerability, how vulnerable the community is, potential harm, informed consent. Is it possible to obtain informed consent, confidentiality, intellectual property rights? So in terms of confidentiality, for example, even if you anonymize, if you quote a statement, for example, a tweet, and you don't say who tweeted this, it's easy for anybody to go to the search engine and to identify who tweeted that tweet. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And more recently, there has been another paper in Jamir, and I don't have time to go into that, but it's also an interesting paper where authors developed a taxonomy on ethical issues in using Twitter for public health surveillance and research. And I invite you to have a look at this. So when I talk about infodemiology studies, there's a kind of a spectrum of kind of studies we do, which reach from passive monitoring of social media postings or tweets to more like active interventions like the Facebook study or participatory surveillance where people actually fill in surveys. And there's obviously a continuum of what's possible in terms of in getting informed consent and giving people the ability to opt out. Now I want to close with two crazy ideas I have. So one is, I think there should be some sort of a voluntary standard for companies to kind of disclose what kind of research is going on, even disclosing A/B tests. And so I propose that there should be maybe a standard URL for example, facebook.com/research, and it's always research, /research, where people can find a complete disclosure on what's going on the website in terms of testing, experiments, and ideally where they also have the ability to opt out. So that's one of my proposals. And I think as researchers and also the companies who are involved, I think we have to get our act together and develop some sort of a code of conduct and a kind of a voluntary self-regulation or self-regulatory organization where we provide notice and choice. And there's a good model for this, because there's this organization, Network Advertising, .org, which is an association of advertisers and advertising platforms. As you know, advertisements these days on the internet are highly targeted, so they collect a lot of information about you, which websites you visit, which links you click on, what your interests are. And that's obviously scary to some, and they have formed this organization where they have a code of conduct, they have an opt-out engine here where you can say, I do not want to have these companies collect my data, and as I said, a code of conduct as well. The other crazy idea, which is in the back of my mind for a couple of years now, is especially in the context of harvesting tweets or other kind of status updates, maybe we should start thinking about some standard language, opt-out language, which consumers can use to make clear if they want to opt out of this kind of monitoring. So it could be like the robot exclusion standard, for example, that we define some keywords which people attach to their tweets, which, for example, indicate that this particular tweet should not be monitored, or this particular user should not be monitored. Obviously, there are two sides to this, because there's a chance of introducing additional bias, but I think it's an ethical thing to do, to give people the ability to opt out. And what our surveys show is that a significant proportion of users actually wants to be able to opt out. Although in reality, I don't think it will be 25% of the who will opt out, but at least if there's another backlash, like the Facebook study backlash, then we as researchers can say, look, here's the mechanism for you to opt out of these kind of trials or monitoring. So conclusions only because information is public, or even if it's collected or analyzed or monitored for honorable purposes like public health, consumers may have issues with large-scale data analysis, especially older people and for sensitive topics. It takes only one poorly framed study to create a media or consumer backlash, with everything that's involved in that, and loss of trust. And consumer education, as well as new industry standards, collaboration among researchers, and technical tools for opt-out and disclosure infrastructure may be part of the answer. Thank you very much.